Alright, from my last video, I'm judging that some newer people were kind of confused as to what is actually going on in the meta. What are these decks? So, trying to start a little series with some shorts, just kind of going through what these decks are, what do they look like, how do we play against them. So, we'll jump into it. A lot of these decks I'm going to show in here were provided by Ophthalmoscope. Great guy on the Discord. If you're not on the Discord, grab the link down below, but let's get into it. So the meta breaks down into kind of four main archetypes. You've got your aggro, your mid-range, your stall, and your combo. The aggro, typically the main game plan is that you want to beat down pretty quickly, or you want to be able to take 6 prizes over the course of the game to win. Those kind of break down into whether they use Dodrio or whether they use Scyther. And then they kind of subdivide once again into whether they're using, Wigglytuff, or they aren't, or they have some other kind of plan. Now, you come out with these on the end. I'll get more of those a little bit later on. These are the kind of decks I would suggest starting with, as they're probably a little bit easier to pilot than some of the others, and they give you a really good feel for the game and what it takes to win. The mid-range decks, usually these take a little more setup. They're a little more tanky, and what they're trying to do is kind of set up and maybe take control of the aggro game, slow them down, and win that way. And then they also have some sort of game plan to beat stall as well. Speaking of stall, our stall decks over here are mostly just trying to slow the game down to a crawl, and then they are just trying to basically deck out their opponent. It's probably one of the stronger strategies in base fossil, to be fair, but we do have some decks that can definitely beat it, and any deck can really beat stall. It's just a large percentage of the time stall probably has the upper hand. And then our final decks are our combo decks. These are typically trying to do something kind of unfair and either donk the opponent, which means that they knock out all their Pokemon, which usually they don't have up to all 6 on their, active and on bench. So trying to kill pretty quickly and early, or take advantage of the single Pokemon on the other opponent's side. Or they set up very quickly and just repeatedly just bash in with big damage. We'll get more into these later. Today, I just want to talk about our aggro decks because they're kind of the biggest field and they're some of the most awkwardly named. But before we get into the archetypes, let's talk about our big players. So the one that kind of started this all off is back in the day, there's a deck archetype called Haymaker, which involves, Hitmonchan, Electabuzz, and typically Scyther. We'll get to Scyther here in a second, but Hitmonchan kind of sets the whole aggro tone. It's got 70 HP, which is big for a basic, and it can do 20 damage for 1 energy. All of our kind of big basics that we're going to see here have 70 HP or a little bit more, and do, comparatively high damage for the amount of energy you're putting on them, for base fossil, anyway, okay? Notice a lot of them have 2 retreat. Magmar is the exception. Magmar is also a little bit different in the fact that it can do a little bit of stalling, and it can do a status effect. That's why it appears in one stall deck. We'll get to that way later. Chan also appears in a deck called Big Stepper. So if you see Hitmonchan, it's not always indicative of an aggro deck, typically though. So if you see one of these 3, it could be aggro, but you need to see a little bit more maybe. Other ones that are very typical in these kind of aggro builds would be Mewtwo, Wigglytuff, and Clefable. Notice that they have the same kind of stats, 70 HP, 2 retreat costs. They do high damage, especially in the case of Wigglytuff. And Mewtwo has a very interesting ability we'll talk more about later as well. Also note that Mewtwo appears in stall decks, but the other 2 you can clearly identify as being aggro. As they hit the field, or you see a Jigglypuff, you see a Clefairy, you know that you are up against an aggro deck, okay? Now the other thing you're going to wait and see with these aggro decks is they're always running one of 2 free retreaters. These ones are very similar as well. Notice that they're 70 HP. They have a free retreat cost, the same kind of resistance. The weaknesses is a little bit different. That's kind of where they vary. Their attacks are kind of different-ish, but similar, as you can see. Scyther will also appear in stall decks, so if you see a Scyther hit the field, that doesn't always mean, hey, I'm up against aggro. If you see a Scyther and like a psychic energy goes onto it, that could be stall, so keep that in mind. And Dodrio also appears in the deck Big Stepper. We'll get to that way later on. Less common, so don't worry about that one too much. But usually they're going to have 2 of those kind of big attackers, those main characters we talked about, and then one of these tech Pokemons to help retreat and get their attackers around the field. So how do I identify the matchup when we see these things? So if you see Electabuzz, Wigglytuff, and Clefable, or you see their, stage, or not stage ones, basics, you know you're against an aggro deck. I mean, there are some weird kind of rogue decks, but there's always exceptions. You also want to look for the second Pokemon to kind of confirm what's going on if it's the other ones. You want to usually figure out what two, colors or types of energy they're running, because that'll let you know what kind of weaknesses they're going to be hitting. So if you see an Electabuzz and it gets attached a fighting energy, you know that a Hitmonchan could come down here in a second and start, punching. Let's say you've got a Clefable. You wouldn't want to leave that in the active because you're getting hit for weakness by, a Hitmonchan, something like that, so you know what to expect. Also, you probably want to know what free retreater they're running as well. If you can take advantage of something, like if you yourself are running Electabuzz, and you know they're playing Dodrio, you could, for instance, gust that thing out and kill it instantly with your own Electabuzz. So look for those things that you can take advantage of yourself in that matchup. Now, what are the kind of aggro decks that are out there? The first ones I'm going to start off with are the Wigglytuff variants. The first one is Wigmar. That comes from Wiggly Magmar. Pretty straightforward on that one. So obviously Jigglypuff, Dodrio, and Magmar are kind of your three main Pokemon. Wigglytuff hits for 70 damage with a plus power, so that's why there's two in this deck. Typically there might be more even sometimes, so that's something to be aware of. So Wigglytuff can kill or Oko, as some people say, one of those big basics. So something to know, if you see a Jigglypuff with an energy on it, they could go DCE Wigglytuff plus power and kill your Pokemon. Something to be aware of. Dodrio also is a Pokemon you may not want to chip damage into because of that rage attack. Dodrio can fight, keep that in mind. It can, attack for 2 energy, like 1 basic and a DCE, and it's swinging in for rage, and if it's enough damage, it can kill you. Magmar is also really interesting. It's a little bit different than some of the other big basics because it can use that smoke screen to stall, and if it lands Smog and poisons like a big basic, like a really big basic like Kangaskhan or Chansey, over time it can take that down pretty efficiently. So another thing to keep in mind, and it does retreat for 1, so you only need 1 Dodrio to switch that stuff around. Moving on from there, we have DFW. Notice it looks very similar to Wigmar. It's called DFW from Dodrio fighting Wigglytuff. Now I know that's really awkward, but that's just kind of how the naming convention kind of fell. So fighting is typically Hitmonchan, but anything D something something is usually Dodrio plus something, 2 other big basics or like something like that. Keep that in mind, okay? But notice the deck layout's very similar. The idea being that Hitmonchan can hit a lot of very popular Pokemon for weakness, like, Wigglytuff. Clefable, not so much. Like Kangaskhan, Chansey's, Lickitung is a really big one in the stall decks. So Hitmonchan does hit for a lot of weaknesses, but Hitmonchan is also walled by a lot of Pokemon. You can't get over the resistances of Pokemon like Dodrio, or Scyther, or some of the birds like Articuno that's in Rain Dance. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So very similar to Wigmar. Main difference is you're using Hitmonchan instead of Magmar. So if you see a Jigglypuff with a fighting energy, you know it's DFW and it's not Wigmar. Those are the most 2 popular Wigglytuff decks. Moving on from there, if you see something that doesn't have a Wigglytuff, but you see a Dodrio, and you still see a Hitmonchan, maybe you see some Psychic in the mix, it's probably DFP, that's Dodrio fighting, so Hitmonchan, and Psychic, which is Mewtwo. Awkward, I know it's awkward. Now, this one is a little bit interesting. So if you recognize this is happening, this is one you probably need to be able to, analyze on the field a little bit quicker than some of the others, because it can do some interesting things. So the Mewtwo, we didn't talk about its power yet, but its first attack lets it retrieve energy from the discard. Like that DCE it can use to retreat for 1 energy, or it can power itself up. Notice there's also a card in this deck called Mr. Fuji. So Mewtwo can power itself up, get a bunch of extra energy on it. You can use Fuji to shuffle Mewtwo and all the extra energy cards back into your deck. So be expecting a play like that. So this deck can kind of, quote unquote, stall out a little bit more than some of the other aggressive variants. This deck also usually, almost always, runs Mr. Mime. And Mr. Mime's power walls anything that does more than 20 damage. So it can like wall things like Scyther and some other Pokemon. So be expecting that. So if you can see that it's DFP, have a plan to kill a Mr. Mime. Know you can kill a Mr. Mime. And then Mew, typically it's in this deck just to kill Mewtwo, because a powered up Mewtwo can get killed by a Mew plus a plus power, is basically the idea. So it's there to kill other Mewtwo's, because Mewtwo is weak to Mewtwo. And then Gastly has a very similar attack to Mewtwo where it can get energy back. So those are things you want to be aware of. This deck has a little more finesse and tech pieces than some of the others. So this is one you want to be able to identify quickly. Other decks that have a similar layout but no Wigglytuff, that would be your Fablemaker, would be kind of like one of the last in this category that uses Dodrio. So Fablemaker just coming from Clefable, and then Haymaker, which is awkward. That was kind of the old name for the Haymaker decks with big basics, so it's Fablemaker is where we've kind of settled it. Fablemaker is probably one of the least popular decks, to be honest. Basically, the Clefable can use Metronome to copy a lot of attacks, but that can also be a downside, because if your opponent puts down a Dodrio, or not a Dodrio, or a Doduo, for instance, you're not going to be able to do much. Or if they puts down something like, I don't know, a Ditto, your Clefable isn't doing anything. And like other Pokemon are walled by Hitmonchan that Clefable can't hit. So that's why Electabuzz, this promo one, appears in this deck. This is not the Electabuzz we saw earlier. And notice that it is weaker, but it has an attack that does possibly 30 damage on a coin flip for 1 DCE. That's why it's here, is to kill Doduos, essentially. So it's something you'd sprinkle into other decks, but the reason it's here is because this deck struggles against, the birds, essentially. Well, mostly Doduo, okay? One of the less popular decks, I wouldn't worry about this so much, but if you see Clefairy, this is the deck that you're playing against, okay? Our last category is kind of a grab bag. It's the Tradmakers, so these are using Scyther instead of Dodrio. And really, you can sprinkle in any of the big basics to your taste. Notice I said basics, so not your Stage 1 Pokemon that we showed earlier. And this typically also runs Ditto, because Ditto takes care of some interesting Pokemon for you and gives you some options. Notice this deck is going to have a little bit harder time retreating than the other ones, because it doesn't get that, discount to retreating. So it does have scoop ups, and it does have a couple more energy cards than you would see in the Dodrio build. So it's kind of the trade-off there. But that's pretty much it for the aggro. I'll be probably doing the rest of the deck archetypes in one more video, follow later on. If you have any questions, suggestions, requests, put them down below. If you're not on the Discord, join the Discord. That's a great place to get information. Everyone's great there. And if you're not on TCG1, get on there and start grinding, start learning the game. You're not going to learn if you don't lose a couple games. It's okay. But hopefully I see you on there, and keep grinding some Pokemon. Bye.